Kenneth was the type of man who couldn't hold his tongue. He had a habit of talking, and not just in the right moments, but at the wrong times as well. He had a story for everything, an opinion on anything, and always felt the need to express himself, even if no one asked. One sunny afternoon, Kenneth and his wife, Sandra, were at a family gathering. Everyone was seated, chatting comfortably, when Kenneth took the spotlight. He was talking loudly about a new business idea he had, despite the fact that no one had asked him about it. "You know," he said, looking around the room, "I think I'm going to start selling imported car parts. People don't realize how much money is in it. I did some research, and I've got the numbers right here." He pulled out his phone, waving it around like a piece of evidence in court. Sandra, who was sitting beside him, closed her eyes and sighed. She felt the familiar ache in her chest as her husband continued to dominate the conversation. She wanted to crawl under the table, but she forced a smile. "Ken, maybe we should let others share their thoughts too," she suggested gently. But Kenneth didn't hear her. "No, Sandra, I'm telling them something important. This is going to make me rich. Can you imagine how much money we could make?" he continued, oblivious to the uncomfortable stares from the other guests. Sandra's face flushed with embarrassment, but she had learned not to confront Kenneth in public. Instead, she smiled and nodded, her heart sinking. He never seemed to realize how often he put her in these situations. After all, he didn't just talk in the right moments, he spoke all the time. Even when Sandra was talking to someone else, Kenneth would interrupt, offering unsolicited advice or commenting on the conversation, even when his input wasn't needed. That night, when they were alone at home, Sandra tried to bring it up. "Ken, I think you should be more mindful of when you speak. You embarrassed me today, in front of the whole family," she said, her voice tired. Kenneth, however, didn't take it well. He sat up straight, as though ready to defend himself. "What do you mean? I was just trying to share some valuable information. Everyone needs to know what I know." His voice grew louder as he spoke, and Sandra could feel her frustration rising. "You're always talking, Ken. Even when it's not the right time. You never listen when I say something, and you don't even apologize when you've said the wrong thing." Sandra's voice cracked, and she felt her eyes sting with the beginnings of tears. Kenneth stared at her, unblinking. "I don't see what the big deal is, Sandra. I'm just trying to help. What's wrong with that?" Sandra, exhausted from years of this same argument, knew that there was no point in continuing. She walked to the kitchen, trying to calm herself down. She loved her husband, but his constant talking was draining. It wasn't just at family gatherings, it was everywhere. At the market, in church, at the bank. He couldn't stop talking. But Sandra had learned how to deal with it. She couldn't change him, but she could find ways to cope. Over the years, she'd mastered the art of redirecting his attention, making small comments to bring him back down to earth. She'd learned how to communicate her needs in a way that didn't escalate his defensiveness. And yet, the constant exhaustion was taking its toll. One day, Sandra decided she was done being quiet. It was time to speak up, not out of anger, but out of love. She sat Kenneth down and told him, "Ken, I love you, but I need you to understand something. When you talk like that, you make me feel invisible. You don't listen to me, and you don't care how your words affect me. I'm not asking you to stop being yourself, but I need you to be mindful of me too." Kenneth's face softened. He had never seen Sandra so serious. "I didn't realize I was making you feel that way," he admitted, his voice low. "I guess I just get carried away sometimes. I don't want to hurt you, Sandra." For the first time in years, Kenneth took responsibility for his actions. He didn't make excuses, he didn't deflect. He just listened. And that, Sandra realized, was a step in the right direction. The following weeks weren't perfect. Kenneth still had his moments when he would talk too much, but he tried. When he caught himself, he would apologize, sometimes even before Sandra could say anything. And Sandra, in turn, found ways to gently redirect him when he got carried away, without making him feel small or unheard. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was progress. Sandra was still exhausted at times, but she could see the change in Kenneth. It wasn't just about talking less, it was about listening more. He was starting to realize that there was power in silence, that sometimes, it was okay to just be present without speaking. And so, Sandra and Kenneth began to rebuild their communication, one small conversation at a time. Kenneth learned to be more considerate, and Sandra learned to speak up for herself, to set boundaries in a loving, firm way. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was getting stronger. They both realized that love wasn't just about being heard, it was about hearing each other too. As Sandra sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she smiled to herself. Things were changing, slowly but surely. She wasn't exhausted anymore, and Kenneth had learned the most important lesson. Sometimes, the most meaningful conversations were the ones that didn't need words at all. And so, Sandra and Kenneth's journey continued, together, growing, learning, and speaking when it mattered most. As the weeks passed, Sandra noticed something different in Kenneth. He was still talkative, but he was beginning to recognize the moments when silence spoke louder than words. Sandra had to admit, it was a small victory, but it made a world of difference. They could go on dates now without Kenneth feeling the need to monopolize the conversation. Instead, they shared their thoughts, their laughter, and most importantly, their silence. One evening, as they sat in a small cafe by the roadside, Kenneth, for the first time in a long while, let Sandra lead the conversation. He listened with full attention as she told him about her day. She was surprised by how genuinely interested he seemed. He wasn't interrupting or rushing to share his own thoughts. It felt like a victory, not just for Sandra, but for their marriage. Sandra smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Ken, you know, I appreciate this," she said softly. "Just listening and letting me talk without trying to fix everything I say." Kenneth smiled back, his face showing genuine remorse. "I guess I never really understood how important that is. But I'm trying, Sandra. I know I've messed up in the past, but I want to get better. I want us to be better." Sandra felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't often that Kenneth expressed his feelings so openly, and hearing him speak with such sincerity touched her deeply. She had spent so much time wondering if he would ever change, but now, she could see the effort he was putting in. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice from a neighboring table. It was Sandra's old friend, Ngozi. She waved excitedly as she stood up to greet them. "Hey, Sandra. Kenneth. Long time no see," Ngozi exclaimed, pulling Sandra into a warm hug. Kenneth grinned. "Ngozi, you always show up at the right time," he said, chuckling. Sandra smiled at his words. It wasn't the usual over-the-top comment, but a genuine, friendly one. It seemed like the Kenneth she had always hoped for was beginning to emerge more often. They spent the next hour catching up with Ngozi, with Kenneth surprisingly holding back on his usual barrage of comments. Sandra couldn't help but notice how calm and collected he was, letting the conversation flow naturally. Even when Ngozi mentioned a new restaurant opening in town, Kenneth didn't feel the need to talk about all the food he had tried there. He simply smiled and said, "Sounds interesting." Sandra was starting to feel like she had the husband she always dreamed of. It wasn't perfection, but it was a big improvement. Kenneth was learning, growing, and making an effort, and Sandra realized how much she appreciated it.